We have spent our entire existence telling stories. But has anyone ever wondered what the very first story told by one human being to another was? The first narrative, the first time a person, inspired by their experiences, created a story about events that never happened and shared it with another human being. What was it about? What made them tell it? That story is lost in the void. It's impossible to retrieve it from oblivion. But from that moment, buried in the shadows of time, we have never stopped telling stories. My name is Vilches, and I am a Spanish writer. So this subject touches me deeply. Despite my profession, my academic background is in history. I have degrees in both history and art history. I've never worked directly in these fields, nor have I taught, although I felt a strong calling to do so and had the opportunity at one point in my life. In the end, I chose literature, to write my own stories. My knowledge of history and art, especially ancient art, has provided a foundation for the construction and development of my fictional universes, especially in the epic saga. But that's another story I won't go into now. One of the most fascinating areas for me has always been the origins of things, historical milestones, the realities we live with today that often go unnoticed. How did we start doing things? How did we discover or develop them? I have often pondered this question. Who told the first story? What was that first story? I approach it not in search of a definitive answer. Such a thing is probably lost in the mists of time, but as a starting point for an intellectual journey. Unless we find a way to travel back and witness it for ourselves, we may never know. Still, speculation itself is a pursuit I enjoy, grounded in as much scientific evidence and realism as possible. It's not just fantasy, it's informed conjecture. It's likely that we've lost more stories than we've preserved. Let's look at the numbers, not that I'm particularly good at calculations. Generously, we've been recording stories for about 5,000 years. But as a species, we've had the capacity to speak for between 2 and 2.5 million years, according to the latest research. That's 2 million years of potential storytelling, with only the last 5,000 years documented. Clearly, most of our storytelling has been lost. In this vast expanse of time, this vast horizonless plain that is but a cosmic blink of an eye, when did the first story emerge? The ability to speak doesn't necessarily mean the development of a language, even a primitive one. Nor does it imply the ability to construct what we now understand as a story or narrative. It's hard to imagine such a capacity without formal thought, and the development of formal thought seems to require language. But perhaps, we can't be sure, we are underestimating our distant ancestors. It's possible that the first story wasn't even spoken, but conveyed through gestures. It may have been told by movement alone. We'll never know for sure, that much is certain. I tend to be conservative in this regard and firmly believe that the first stories emerged when our ancestors began to ask the earliest questions, the true, profound ones. When they began to become truly aware of themselves, of others, of the world around them, and began to inquire, how, when, where, who? And the question we are truly meant to ask, the mother of all questions, the most formidable and disruptive of all questions, the one that has changed us and through us the world. My favorite. Why? Our doubts, our fears, our uncertainties, these, I am convinced, constructed the first narrative. And that story had a singular purpose, to provide answers. My intuition tells me that the first story ever told was that of one of our ancestors, speculating in his nascent innocence about how we got here, when it happened, where we came from, what we are the result of and why. The first story was a cosmogony, a story explaining our origins, our place in the world, a story of creation. There is something that has always fascinated me about cosmogonies, my suspicion that their roots reach back to the very beginning of time, and that in their lines we can glimpse, perhaps distortedly, as if peering through a cloudy and unfocused lens, the glimmers of thought of our most distant ancestors, traces of how they understood, explained and feared the world around them, and what that world was like for them. Echoes from a past so distant it is dizzying to contemplate. Not for nothing do those familiar with my work know that the Jade Oracle, the very element that justifies the title of my epic saga in English, the foundation that gives meaning to the whole work, is in fact a cosmogony. There are many cosmogonies, almost as many as there are cultures that have survived to the present day, and many more that have disappeared over time, but whose stories have been preserved in written form. Perhaps the most famous is the biblical account of creation, which is in fact the Cosmogony that reflects the worldview of the Hebrew people. From my point of view as a writer, it is neither the oldest nor the most complex. Its importance is not because it is the most compelling, robust, or profound, but because of its historical journey alongside Christianity and its widespread dissemination. While I acknowledge that some people still regard it as the sole or absolute explanation of creation, the reality is that the biblical creation myth serves the same purpose as other cosmogonies, to elucidate the place of a people in the world, in this case, that of the ancient Hebrew community. In its verses, one can hear echoes of those early mountain pastoral communities who inhabited a harsh, rugged world with unpredictable climates. In an act of remarkable syncretism, anomalous for their environment, they unified the origin of all things into a single creative being, one who made man from clay, a notable detail, and woman from man. This is a striking feature not commonly found in many cosmogonies, the explicit portrayal of woman as a derivative creation of man. In the biblical narrative, from the very beginning, woman is positioned as subordinate to man. She is not an original creation of the divine, but a derivative, formed from part of the original creation, man. This is at least intriguing and revealing. I do not intend to enter into a debate here, as it would go off topic, but it is worth noting that much of the historical dominance of the male over the female, the subjugation of women by men throughout human history, has been justified by this particular creation narrative. This is due to its global adoption by Christianity, which subsequently spread across the planet to become one of the great enduring religions of humanity. This singular creative deity has given them a paradise in which to dwell, perhaps a reminder of a historical period when their ancestors inhabited a more hospitable land, and also a memory of their expulsion from it, or perhaps a projection of the utopian place longed for by the inhabitants of a harsh and rugged land. Possibly, those early humans, represented by the ancestral couple, were expelled from this paradise because of disobedience, specifically that of the woman, who is considered much weaker and more imperfect as a residual product of God's true creation. A transgression on the part of the feminine that drags the masculine into guilt, a guilt that both must atone for eternally. This fault and guilt is passed on to their descendants. In essence, this is the canon with which most of us are familiar, although the reality is somewhat more complex and speaks of migratory flows, of contacts between earlier human groups that would form the seed of the Hebrew people. I believe that the biblical narrative allows us to glimpse fascinating details of how the original Hebrew people perceived their world at that time, and also of their journey through it before they recognized themselves at the moment of the creation of the narrative. They were a pragmatic people, there is no doubt about that. They resolved their initial existential concerns by syncretizing the reason for the existence of everything into a single creative figure. Everything exists and happens through a single will. It is a simple yet effective approach that answers all the questions posed in one fell swoop. Monotheism, the belief in a single divine being responsible for everything, is a real rarity. It may seem the opposite today, given that many of today's major religions are direct descendants of this primitive worldview developed by the Hebrews. But believe me, it is quite the opposite. Many may think that it is a more evolved way of conceiving of the relationship with the divine, but the truth is that it is much simpler, though more functional. It is much simpler to explain everything from a single point of origin. Why did the ancient Hebrews come up with this idea? I believe the key lies in the echoes we can sense in their own narrative. The ancient Hebrews saw themselves as a wandering people, a situation that begins with the terrible drama of the expulsion from paradise. And I think this corresponds to an ancestral memory embedded in the collective memory of those early humans. Perhaps a memory of a nomadic phase, a primitive memory of societies in motion. It is conceivable that this lost paradise echoes the memory of a fertile land that their ancestors were forced to abandon for some reason. Perhaps these identityless nomads told this ancient story around the fire, a story with roots deep in prehistory, the echo of a fertile land that had to be abandoned in a primordial era. Such a tale could have instilled in those early wanderers a profound sense of vulnerability and helplessness, at the mercy of the destructive and unpredictable forces of nature, much like the region's capricious climate. In response, they forged a divine figure to match these parameters, a paternal figure, a shepherd god tending his flock. This association is not surprising given that the early Hebrews were pastoral communities, a demanding and uncertain vocation, the implications of which they understood intimately. This figure was perfectly suited to their needs and their worldview. They saw themselves as the flock, lost without the guidance of the shepherd, whom they had to obey to ensure their success. The shepherd rewards the obedience of the flock and punishes the deviation of those sheep who stray from the path. This dynamic precisely defines the nature of the relationship with the divinity that this people developed: obedience and loyalty, total trust in the leader, or punishment and ruin. In the mental framework of a pastoral community, this view of the world seemed not only logical, but also the only efficient one. The Hebrews were not alone in conceiving a model of a God who punishes and rewards, who becomes angry when his wishes are not fulfilled. Historians refer to this model as the God who strikes with a hammer, because of its common artistic representation. This concept is observed from the Nile Delta to Anatolia, but in the case of the Hebrews, the seamless connection that can be drawn to justify the model is particularly compelling. Human groups have constructed their creation myths from what they perceived, what was close to them, and what constituted their world at the time. For this reason, these stories can reveal much about the ancestral nature of these peoples, their collective memory, and even about times before the moments in which the myth was created, times that may correspond to the way in which these ancient peoples looked back on their past. References to ice, snow, or cold in the environment are abundant in Norse cosmogonies, which makes sense for a people who in some cases lived very close to the Arctic Circle. However, it is more unusual to find such references among Native Americans. They are particularly prominent among the indigenous groups that once inhabited the northern part of the continent before the arrival of Europeans, in the lands that now form the northern border of the United States and Canada. These references appear in creation myths which, until recently, were passed down orally as they were originally told. It is both curious and significant that many of these stories describe an origin as people of the ice, a concept attributed to their ancestors, or a frozen world as the primordial beginning. In these stories, the retreat from or overcoming of this icy world is presented as a pivotal or essential event in their cosmogony. This is all the more remarkable because there is a great deal of archaeological and geological evidence that links these indigenous peoples of North America with the descendants of the so-called Clovis culture. The Clovis culture is characterized by the distinctive remains of its stone industry, mainly arrowheads and spearheads carved with a unique technique, which were spread over a wide area of the aforementioned territories. It is strongly believed that these peoples arrived there through migratory flows from what is now Siberian Russia, entering the American continent via what is now the Bering Strait, which at the time connected the continents by land. We are looking at the first human inhabitants of the Americas, who, after leaving the Eurasian landmass via its northernmost tip, reached the lands of a new continent, the Americas, at a time that can be pinpointed to be somewhere between 16,000 and 12,000 years ago. By about 10,000 years ago, they may have managed to settle on the plains of the northern center of the continent, eventually giving rise to what we now understand as the indigenous peoples of North America that we all know today. What is particularly interesting is that what these migrating peoples found when they arrived in the Americas, as confirmed by numerous archaeological and geological findings, was a wall of ice, a land dominated by glaciation. At some point, in its final stages as the glaciers receded, a passageway opened up, allowing these peoples to move through, settle and develop the Clovis industry, which would eventually become the root that would shape the various indigenous peoples. In some of their creation stories, in some of their cosmogonies, this memory seems to have been fossilized. In the collective memory of some of these peoples, echoes and traces of that glacial moment seem to have been preserved, a memory of that Ice Age period. If we can surmise that such fossilized memories exist in their creation stories, those early tales told by the fire, passed down orally from generation to generation, which endured and became enshrined in ancestral myths that explain their place in the world, their answers to the questions of when, where, and how, then it is not unreasonable to consider that echoes of similar memories might also be found in the cosmogonies of other peoples and cultures. Admittedly, this is speculative, but could it be that the world ruled by Titans, as depicted in ancient Norse and even Greek cosmogonies, speaks of a prehistoric past ruled not only by the inexorable forces of nature, but also by distant memories of a world shared with the great specimens of Pleistocene megafauna, such as mammoths or woolly rhinoceroses. A world of giants titans that our ancestors witnessed, confronted, and eventually saw disappear to make way for the world we know today. It is a question we may never be able to answer with the certainty required to take it as fact, but there are reasonable suspicions about where the roots of these ancient cosmogonies may lie, and the echoes of what they really tell us, beyond the colorful world presented in myth. The oldest of these to be recorded in writing, that is, the earliest preserved cosmogony, is the Sumerian. The Sumerians were a people who developed in Mesopotamia, between the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, and the Sumerian culture is recognized as the first human civilization to possess the essential elements to be considered our earliest recognized civilization. Among other achievements, they are credited with the creation of the first writing system, cuneiform. The Sumerians were later invaded by their northern neighbors, the Akkadians, resulting in a hybrid culture in which the conquerors were in a sense absorbed by the conquered. Both peoples clearly emerged from the development of the earliest Neolithic communities in the region, the first human groups to settle down, to build villages, towns, and cities, to domesticate animals, to practice agriculture and pottery. In essence, to lay the foundations of what we understand as civilization. It is particularly interesting to note that one of the stories preserved, thanks to the writing system developed by the Sumerians, was their own cosmogony, their creation story, their explanation of the world and its origins. This narrative is of extraordinary richness, apart from being the earliest and oldest for which we have written records. The whole account must be constructed from various fragments and tablets, whose origins are neither singular nor recorded at a single point in time. It is a fragmented narrative, but one that clearly points to a common origin. The section detailing the creation comes to us through an extensive poem known as the Atrahasis, inscribed more than a millennium and a half before Christ. This is the earliest creation story that mankind has managed to preserve, but it should not be seen as a beginning, but rather as the culmination of thousands of years of oral tradition, a retrospective view of time. A story that has probably absorbed and been enriched by many others, imbued with various nuances that have both enhanced and perhaps in some way distorted it, until it was finally encapsulated in writing. The human groups that would later be identified as Sumerian or Akkadian, those communities that told themselves their intuitive explanations of where they came from, what reason or event justified their existence, found their answers by identifying themselves as creations of others. This idea is quite understandable in a productive society. If we possess the ability to create, it is plausible that our existence is the result of having been created. These gods share many features, both anatomical and social, that are recognizably human, yet they must transcend humanity in order to be credited with the ability to create humanity. They must be superior. Thus we encounter the earliest concept of a god. This is where the first images of creator deities come from. Nevertheless, and this is again a speculative journey that I am merely inviting you to undertake, I believe that the figure of the creator gods, generally speaking, from those conceived in the Sumerian cosmogony to any other cosmogony that eventually came down to writing, was not the first image by which we explained our existence. It is not our oldest perspective. I base this on two intuitive principles. The first is that human understanding, in its most primitive capacity to explain reality, has been conditioned by what it has observed and assimilated from its immediate environment. Allow me to give a brief example. A common constant in all cosmogonies is the repetition of clear observations derived from very basic direct observation, such as the segmentation of the great planes of existence. For example, the earth is observed, the sky, in some cases the waters, very common in coastal cultures or those with early access to large bodies of water, and in many cases the intuition of a deep plane, the underworld. This is a very obvious division, which probably became clear in the mental framework of all our ancestors very early on, simply through observation. In general, the earth is associated with humanity and wildlife. It is our domain, something easily ascertainable by observation. The unreachable heavens are seen as the realm of the extraordinary, beyond human reach, so it is not surprising that they became the dwelling place of the gods. The underworld is seen as the domain of danger and concealment, perhaps, I dare say, because early humans associated the subterranean with catastrophic and violent events such as the emission of toxic gases, earthquakes, or magmatic flows. Mankind has also observed and understood the obvious sexual dimorphism of our species, the obvious differences between man and woman, although they belong to the same nature, so that all cosmogonies include an explanation of the origin of both sexes of the species. I am deeply convinced that the oldest and most primitive versions of the story already included these aspects. Another common constant is the inclusion of local and familiar elements in these primordial tales. So it should come as no surprise, for example, that local fauna are included in the stories, even deified: hawks, jackals, and crocodiles in the Egyptian cosmogony, snakes and jaguars in the Mesoamerican, elephants in the Hindu tradition. I am convinced that the earliest deifications were forces of nature and local animals whose interactions with human reality at the time inspired fear, respect, or dependence. The initial stages of that primitive first story we once told ourselves had different actors and relationships. But we have irretrievably lost those primordial stages. They have been superimposed by later versions of the narrative. In this context, I believe that the emergence of humanity would have been more logically conceived through conception rather than creation. I like to think that in these lost stories humans were born from the gods. They were not created but conceived. We appeared as the children or offspring of the gods, not as their manufactured products. The concept of creation, I feel, corresponds to a more advanced stage in which man perceives himself as a maker, as a creator, after the significant milestone of sedentarization and production, especially of pottery. A technological stage that all human groups, wherever they were, had to pass through. It is just a personal suspicion, based solely on intuition, supported by my own academic training. Creator gods were incorporated into the narrative, eventually fixed in writing, in all preserved cosmogonies, at some point from the Neolithic onwards. The Sumerians called these creator gods the Annuna, while the Akkadians called them the Annuna-ki, the children of Anu. At this point I would like to add a brief but emphatic footnote. Much has been written and speculated about the Annuna-ki. However, the vast majority of what the general public believes they know about them is profoundly divorced from reality. This is particularly true of the pseudo-scientific narrative which, based on Sumerian references to the Annuna-ki, posits an extraterrestrial creationist theory. In essence, it claims that the Atrahasis poem recounts the creation of mankind by an extraterrestrial race, an idea that is clearly false, pure fiction. In fact, it comes from the imagination of a single author, Zakaria Sitchin, an Azerbaijani-born writer who lived from 1920 to 2010. In the 1970s, he published a series of novels in the pseudo-scientific style popular at the time. In these works, he introduced the outlines of this theory, which he claimed was based on his own translations of Sumerian tablets and the conclusions he drew from them. Sitchin uses a technique that is no longer literary but clearly commercial, one that we would undoubtedly now call clickbait. This technique consists of presenting a work of fiction as real and true, be it historical or scientific, purely and simply to hook the audience and ensure higher sales. He is not alone in using this method, and all those who have used it have led their readers into the same confusion. They all rely on the same resource, supposedly exclusive information, sometimes of a secret nature, which is said to come from real sources, supposedly legitimizing the authenticity of the story, but which only the author knows. In other cases, existing real sources are used, but with dubious reputations or marginal theories that underpin the core of the story and ultimately give it the appearance of truth. These supposed sources are skillfully manipulated by the author to present a narrative that appears consistent and credible. Examples include Benitez, the Trojan Horse, which is based on the alleged existence of secret material from U.S. agencies about an alleged time travel to the time of Jesus, or the Da Vinci Code, which is based on marginal and often contradictory theories about the meaning of the Holy Grail in relation to the works of the Italian genius. Fictional works which in no way prove the existence of their sources, but which are popular precisely because of the doubts and debates they provoke in the public mind, contributing to the spread of pseudo-historical and pseudo-scientific discourses which, although highly popular and profitable for their authors and all those involved, are profoundly damaging to solid and verifiable knowledge. Sitchin's case is even more blatant because the supposed validity of his claims rests on two facts that are absolutely and sufficiently proven to be false. The first is that the tablets he claims to have translated are mistranslated, and he inferred details from them that leading experts in the field unanimously agree are not there. In other words, Sitchin translates and interprets as he pleases, picking and choosing as he pleases, always in favor of the fictional construction of his work, the ultimate goal of which is to sell more books, ergo make more money. The second is the incontrovertible evidence that, in addition to the above, Sitchin simply invents tablets, fragments and sources from the Sumerian narrative that do not exist. In other words, the extraterrestrial genesis theory that can be understood from reading Sitchin's work is based on a highly dubious, inaccurate and downright malicious translation of the originals, a point unanimously emphasized by the leading experts in the field, and on the outright fabrication of many of these sources. I mention this point because of the inherent danger of confusion that such works pose, tarnishing the honest and hard work of professionals who are genuinely investigating our past. It's the danger of allowing a writer to fantasize about vague lines in our sources and our history. In this sense, with this initiative, I too am treading those blurred lines and engaging in speculation in areas of knowledge that I acknowledge from the outset are impossible to prove. I offer a controlled speculation, one that strives not to stray too far from the reasonable, but is still very far from being defended as anything more than the intuition of a trained individual, navigating between the curiosity of a historian and the scientific training with the imagination and emotional intuition of a writer. Yet I accept that nothing, absolutely nothing, that I say should or can be taken as a real explanation, simply because it would be dishonest on my part, a fraud, a blatant lie, which I am not prepared to allow. What the general public should always bear in mind is that contemporary literary works are always fictional, always. They are not meant to produce true knowledge. They are meant to entertain. You can try to recreate a historical period by immersing yourself in serious sources or studies, or you can try to lend credibility to a story by speculating on the plausibility of certain theories, even if those theories have not gained consensus within the scientific community. But the end product is always fictional. Otherwise, there are methods and ways of defending a theory, however revolutionary its approach may be. If these writers had really wanted to reveal a truth to the world, instead of writing a novel, they should have written an essay or a scientific article, but of course they would also have had to provide the evidence to support their conclusions. Evidence that they do not possess in any case, and which they would have to submit to a scientific test that they would never pass without it. Their aim is never to convince professionals in the field or the scientific community, but to reach non-specialist readers. That is why their works are steeped in pseudoscience, not science. Every novel is and always will be fiction for entertainment, never a source of empirical knowledge. Anyone who does not understand this, who believes that a novel reveals scientific truth, is simply making a grave mistake. With that point clarified, and to return to the juicy topic that has motivated this chapter, these creator gods in the Sumerian cosmogony shape humans out of clay. This is the first reference to the creation of humanity from clay, and it is not original to the biblical narrative. In fact, the biblical discourse borrows it from here. It is probably the result of the influence that Sumerian cosmogony was already having on the surrounding peoples, one of which would later form the Hebrew culture. And it will not be the only borrowing that the biblical narrative will make from the Sumerians. My intuition leads me to believe, and this is a purely personal speculation, that this element was not chosen at random, nor is it at all circumstantial or minor. I believe it takes us back to the very Neolithic memory of these human groups. The Neolithic pottery revolution is one of those key pieces in the paradigm shift that human sedentarization brought, especially alongside agriculture. Humans found in clay a magical, malleable material that could be shaped at will to achieve any desired form, from the construction of a stable, durable hut to bowls, vessels, pots, ornaments, and various tools. By definition, clay becomes the material of creation for these human groups. Easier to work with, more malleable and creative than stone, bone, or wood. And it also represented the most advanced technology of the time. So I don't think it's a coincidence that clay was the material used by the creator gods to shape humanity. The Sumerian creation myth is much more complex than the biblical one, although it is the first. It presents a group of primordial gods, creators, representing natural aspects such as the sky, and also the recognition of female goddesses associated with fertility. Uterine goddesses who are absent from the biblical concept of creation, but whose existence can be assumed archaeologically since prehistory. The association of fertility with femininity is deeply intuitive. It is an aspect that human groups would have associated with women very early on, so it is quite natural that it should appear in the narratives. The strange thing is that it does not appear in the biblical account. The excuse for the creation of humanity in the Sumerian account is based on the gods, tired of working, protesting and declaring a strike, whereupon it is decided to create a race of workers, which would be humanity. Far from being an empirical demonstration that we are the product of an alien race that created us in order to enslave us, I personally believe that it reinforces the idea that the probable and ancient oral discourse, which undoubtedly served as the basis for what was eventually written, at this point incorporates more modern realities derived from the pros and cons of sedentarization, and that these echoes of their Neolithic past are reflected, embedded in the narrative from this point on. In particular, agriculture as a Neolithic innovation offers many advantages. It eliminates the need to chase hunting herds, it removes the problem of seasonal food shortages, and it now offers a complementary resource. However, cultivating the land requires hard and constant work, and also involves indirect areas such as the construction of canals, grain stores, milling tools. Our ancestors accepted the advantages of producing food for the whole community in quantities that would guarantee their survival, especially in harsher climatic periods, for which they had to settle in a fixed place, but at the cost of devoting most of their time and effort to maintaining all the infrastructure that farming required. It is in this sense that we can understand the line from the biblical narrative in which the first couple, Adam and Eve, are expelled from paradise for their disobedience and punished to earn their bread by the sweat of their brow. It could refer precisely to the necessary concession demanded by Neolithic sedentarization and the development and exploitation of agriculture. That the biblical paradise is actually an echo of the idealized memory of hunter-gatherer societies, in which man could simply take from nature what was within his reach. In the same sense, I believe that the Sumerian account also provides us with echoes of the first social stratification in those early Neolithic communities. The necessary emergence of leaders, elites responsible for social organization, and the division and specialization of labor within the community. The process of the creation of mankind itself is interesting because it is very similar to the process of brick-making, which, it should be remembered, was a cutting-edge technology at the time. Far from being the work of a potter, as the biblical account suggests, it is the complex mass-production technique typical of a stonemason. Human beings are created equally, without distinction between men and women and in equal numbers, from a mold in which divine blood is mixed with clay. The mixing of divine blood in the Sumerian account brings me back to the idea that in earlier, lost versions we were probably conceived, begotten by our divine figures. In this version, that echo is reflected through the use of blood, also through the direct involvement of womb goddesses, divine birthing givers, the feminine, after all, essential for gestation. I find it particularly interesting that these creation stories could also capture and fossilize memories of catastrophic events, natural or otherwise, that may have shaped the collective memory of the communities that constructed these stories. In this sense, both the Sumerian poem and the biblical account mention the dramatic event of the flood. It should be noted that the original account is the one described in the Atrahasis, and the biblical discourse copies it point by point. Today we would call this blatant plagiarism. In reality, the early Hebrew communities were probably simply echoing a story that was well known and widespread in the region. A story that was probably already part of the folklore, the popular myth, reinforced by the fact that the source of this story was the most powerful and influential civilization of its time. A cultural reference, one might say. The biblical account of Noah isn't just inspired by the flood section in the Atrahasis, it's a cut-and-paste job. It just makes a few minor adjustments to better fit the tone of the biblical discourse and changes the names of the protagonists. Otherwise, it's exactly the same. Far from being seen as intellectual theft, what this shows quite empirically, in my view, is how the dynamics of oral storytelling worked, where there was no problem with incorporating, being influenced by, and assimilating foreign segments and stories into one's own narrative. That is how it worked, and probably all oral traditions gradually filled up with the influence of other oral traditions until they formed the stories that eventually became written. It also shows how permeable these oral traditions were. The most curious thing is that there is reasonable archaeological evidence to suggest that around the 5th millennium BC, there may well have been a catastrophic overflow of the Tigris and Euphrates, which may have inundated and destroyed many of the Neolithic communities settled between their banks. An event that must have been experienced as a universal flood, so devastating that it was recorded in oral tradition. A natural disaster that had nothing to do with divine punishment, but which our ancestors collected and interpreted as such over time. This kind of trace in the creation stories is for me the greatest point of interest, and I could talk about it for hours. I have not mentioned the Egyptian Genesis, its gods of order, and its cyclical conception of the world. The cycle of birth, development, death, and resurrection, as old as nature itself, and in the Egyptian case, irrevocably linked to the cyclical and predictable floods of the Nile. A scheme of a world in order that contrasts so much with the cosmogonies of unpredictable gods typical of more unstable climates, such as the Fertile Crescent or the Middle East. How their discourses, their stories of creation, contain completely different keys that depend exclusively on the geographical environment and the life experiences in that environment of the communities that built these stories. We can look at the peculiarities of the classical cosmogonies, with gods who use humanity as an instrument for their own political intrigues, or the Central European cosmogonies, tied to the forests and to a nature from which they took much longer to disengage. Not to mention the complex notions of Genesis in the East. But I think I have made my point. Our earliest stories were probably those stories in which we desperately tried to justify the reason for our existence, and which certainly contain echoes of experiences, voices, and perspectives from our most ancestral past. But I am sure that alongside these creation stories, these stories driven by our primary need to answer the most basic questions, there were others. We have lost them, like the others, just as we have lost even the oldest versions of the creation stories before they were transcribed and frozen in time. But I have a feeling that even in those first stories, eventually fixed in clay or stone or metal, we find the seed that allows us to sense what other kinds of stories we soon began to tell ourselves around the fire. Alongside those that spoke to us about the creator gods and our place in the world, I am sure that other kinds of stories soon emerged, competing for the audience's attention. Stories and narratives that spoke about us, that focused on our own human nature, our potentials, desires, and aspirations, that served the reference community as metaphors and projections of what every human is capable of, or at least can aspire to. Heroic tales, stories of exceptional individuals who represented an ideal of human potential. Individuals endowed with courage and bravery, often from humble backgrounds, with a thirst for exploration and discovery, capable of overcoming danger and adversity, defying gods and imposed barriers, and earning admiration and respect for their noble deeds, both from their peers and from the gods themselves, who may reward them with extraordinary gifts or even a place among them. The prototype of the hero, his stereotype, would soon be drawn. And we love stories about heroes. Once the model was created, we repeated it endlessly. When we think of heroic stories, the models that come to mind are perhaps those of classical antiquity. Greek demigods like Theseus, Perseus, Jason, or Hercules, Odysseus himself or Achilles, all with a divine component in their blood, secret children of gods or goddesses, or of great royal lineages. All with a destiny in the hands of the gods, all with difficult tasks to undertake, destined to prevail despite the strength or number of enemies, or the stubbornness of the gods themselves and the adversities that seek to provoke their defeat. It is a model that will be repeated throughout time and will echo in all cultures. Norse legends have their heroic sagas, which tell of the deeds of entire lineages. No culture or nation is without its heroes, who come from myth to be recognized as historical figures, whose deeds and legends are often embellished and exaggerated. The knight Roland, El Cid, Siegfried and the Dragon, David against Goliath, Samson, even the biblical narrative has its heroes, King Leonidas defeated at Thermopylae. Legendary heroes and their stories, who inspired with their deeds and the transcendence of their actions. Heroic deeds that sometimes change the course of history and sometimes tell us about sacrifice, courage and bravery to overcome adversity and go where no one has gone before. We love stories of heroes, we have always loved them, where the weak defeat the strong, the righteous conquer the villain, the few overcome the many, friends defeat enemies. Where the defenseless deserve to be defended, the unjust punished, and the aggressor defeated. For the heroic ideal is an ideal of virtue and justice, even if it is utopian. We love stories of heroes who confront the unknown, the hidden, who discover unknown places, who travel beyond the horizon, because they embody human curiosity, the longing to unravel the mystery, what lies beyond what I can see, the answer to the question and the riddle. We haven't stopped telling these stories because we started very early, perhaps at the same time we started drawing the first stories to place ourselves in the world. We know this because they too were captured in writing in the first place where writing was born, our old and beloved Sumeria. The Epic of Gilgamesh is the first known model of this type of story, contemporary, in fact inserted in the same context as the Sumerian cosmogonic narrative, as if it were just a chapter or a spin-off of the Sumerian cosmogony. In the Epic of Gilgamesh we will find all the elements that will later be repeated in many heroic tales. Many, because they will be directly derived from or influenced by the Sumerian myth. They will be inspired by or directly copy whole passages. We will see traces of the epic in the myth of Hercules and Heracles, in Samson, in Homer, but also because this first epic already contains all the elements that we really like to find in inspiring stories. Love, friendship, adventure, sacrifice, overcoming oneself, courage, the search for oneself, transcendence, because I have no doubt that these stories are fundamentally meant to inspire us, to show us what we can achieve as human beings, to give us strength in moments of darkness by reminding us of what others have achieved by facing and overcoming adversity, by getting the gods on their side when everything seemed to be against them, with determination, effort, sometimes uniting loyalties, trusting in oneself and in those who are one's allies. In every individual there is someone extraordinary. Deep down, we are all children of the gods, and we all have the potential. I am absolutely sure that the success of these stories and their early existence is proof that we have always been interested in the same themes: love, betrayal, friendship, heroism, adventure, courage, and overcoming oneself. Thousands, millions of little stories have been lost in the void of time in those ancient campfires where we have never stopped telling stories since time immemorial. Or perhaps they were all collected, mixed and synthesized in the deeds of those first heroes. Who knows? We'll never know. What we do know for sure is that once we started telling stories, we never stopped. And telling stories seems to be as much a part of our human nature as thinking, making, or living in community. Maybe it's just a consequence of those same three things. That's why I feel lucky to be carrying on this ancestral legacy of storytelling, to have chosen one of humanity's oldest and most transcendent professions, to contribute my modest part to the great, inspiring legacy that may have begun around a small campfire so long ago that we've forgotten it. It's a story that's been told a million times. I once received as a criticism trying to undermine my work. Yes, my friend, it is. Like all of them, all stories have been told a million times, and we still want to hear them once more. It has been a pleasure to be with you. Vilches out.